Hey everyone, welcome to CPPCon 2020. I hope the conference has been going really well for you so far. Before I dive into my talk, I do want to just cover a couple announcements. So one, I have a link to our expo hall where you can meet the Microsoft C++ team, and we're going to be there to answer any questions you have about any announcements you've heard throughout the week, or if there's anything from my talk that maybe you didn't get a chance to ask at the end, this is a great spot to follow up on that. Lastly, down at the bottom, you can take our survey, and if you do, you'll get a chance to win a copy of Microsoft Flight Simulator, which looks awesome. So I highly recommend filling that out, and that way we can also learn more about your development experience and keep creating awesome products for you. So with the announcements out of the way, let's dive into the talk. This is a talk about Codespaces, and specifically, it's looking at Codespaces as a way to address remote work, because obviously in the times that we're in right now, a lot of people who used to work in an office are now working remotely, and there's obviously a bunch of challenges that arise because of that. Now, I'm going to be covering ways Codespaces can alleviate that, but then also just in general, even without this remote work context, how Codespaces can be really helpful with your development. So let's first take a look at a couple problems. So when you first start working remotely, I've sort of separated these problems into short-term and long-term. Short-term, you're working remotely. One of the first things you may notice is that you could have underpowered hardware. Maybe you had a really beefy desktop machine at work and you no longer have it now that you're working from home. Perhaps you're on a laptop or a less beefy desktop machine. And especially for C++, we have very large build times. And so if you're operating on even lesser hardware than you're used to, those build times are going to be even more exaggerated. So we're going to see how Codespaces can alleviate some of that. And then also, I think that the trend of working from home is actually going to continue for quite some time. And so in this new world where remote work is a possibility, there are some longer term challenges that could arise. So one, onboarding new team members. A great thing about having a team that can have remote work is that you have a vast pool of people you can pull from now, and they can be in all sorts of different locations, but that can make onboarding them to your code base a bit more challenging. And then lastly, as you work from home for longer and longer periods of time, you may want to use that flexibility to jump around a bit. And so as you're moving around, maybe you can't bring your desktop with you. And so you have this issue of access. You want to be able to access your code from whatever device you may be, even if it's not the most powerful. So we're going to see how Codespaces can help with that as well. And to do that, we're going to jump into a demo. I'm going to demo GitHub Codespaces. And this is probably the coolest thing I've ever demoed. I'm super excited about this. When I first was testing it out, it blew my mind. So I hope you really appreciate it. And with that, let's just dive right into this demo. All right, so I'm on github.com and I'm looking at one of my repositories. This is a fork that I have of the game 2048. It's a console implementation of the game. And I've added a file to it, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But before I jump into GitHub Codespaces, I do just want to give a little bit of context on where I'm coming from. So I've actually demoed this game before, and I do most of my demos on my laptop, which I'm on right now. And to demo anything, I usually end up having to make some changes to my laptop, to my local environment. I have to install certain dependencies. And then if someone watches one of my demos and they want to maybe recreate what I did or test out certain features, or use that code base, they have to make all those same changes to their environment on their end. But GitHub Codespaces really alleviates this issue, and it's just a matter of clicking new Codespace in order for someone to start contributing. So let's actually take a look. If I click code, open with Codespaces, I don't have any current Codespace. All I have to do is click new Codespace, and now it's going to initialize it for me. It's going to set up the environment, get everything I need, all the dependencies. I don't have to worry about a thing. And once this loads up and connects, I'll be able to start contributing. And anyone who has access to that repository could do this exact same thing. You don't need any of the code locally even. And if you'll notice, I haven't even left the browser yet. I'm still in Microsoft Edge. And VS Code has now loaded in the browser I don't even need VS Code locally. So anyone who has a browser even can connect to your code space or can create a code space and connect to it and start contributing, which greatly increases the flexibility and the ease of access and the devices that you can use and connect from. So I'm getting a couple pop-ups on the side about wanting to configure my project. Yes, I do. Now choose a compiler. Okay. And so, yes, I always want to configure. I just clicked yes a couple times, and you can see that I don't want the insider stuff right now. Yes, I'll allow IntelliSense to configure. All right, but anyways, in the meantime, I just clicked OK a couple times, just missed a few pop-ups. But you can see that CMake generation is now done. I didn't have to do anything. Down at the bottom, I have this CMake tools extension, which I didn't have that before. It just got installed for me because the repository, if we look in this .dev container folder right here, this dev container JSON, we can see in this repo, it says, hey, I want people to get the CMake tools extension and the C++ IntelliSense extension. And I want their environment to have a few things that I think everybody needs to be able to play and contribute with my project. So like G++, GCC, rsync, CMake, etc. So with all of that stuff, let's just go ahead and click build. Build starting. Everything's happening in the cloud. I don't even need VS Code locally, and it's done, just like that. I just clicked OK a couple times. So I literally went from clicking Create Codespace on github.com to building this project in like 20 seconds. And I'll even one-up that if I can just start debugging. Boom. So now within like 1 minute of clicking Create Codespace, I'm already now debugging this game. So let's click 1 and then 4 to get a board size, and I can start playing the game. So now I'm debugging the 2048 game in the browser with just a couple clicks of OK, and I don't have to do any configuration. So anyone who has access to that repository can do the same thing. So I just think that it just still blows my mind. I hope you all are super excited about it. And I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the slide where I'm going to show you a link of where you can sign up to get into this public beta. All right, so in blue text here, I've highlighted some of the ways that Codespaces alleviates these problems that I had listed earlier. So for underpowered hardware, well, with Codespaces, your development environment is in the cloud, and the compute runs in the cloud, and it's all offloaded from your local machine. So your local hardware isn't nearly as important anymore. Then, when we look at access, well, all you need is a browser. You don't even need Visual Studio Code locally. You can just open up your browser and connect to your code space from there. And then if we combine the fact that we're offloading compute and we only need to support a browser locally, that means we can connect to our code base and our code space from a huge variety of devices. Now a tablet becomes a feasible device to contribute to a code base. You could, even in a pinch, connect from your phone. Lastly, we looked at the value prop of being able to automatically configure your environment. So if you have new team members, or maybe you've got an open source project and you want contributors to be able to very quickly onboard, well, with Codespaces, all they click is new code space, and all the environment configuration is done automatically, and they can create their own code space from your repository in just a matter of minutes. So I showed connecting to the GitHub code space with VS Code in the browser. You can also connect to it from VS Code in the public beta. And like I said, here's the link to that. You can just go there, maybe take a screen grab or whatever of this slide here and go to that link and get yourself signed up, and you can check it out. But some of you might be thinking, what if I don't use VS Code? What if I'm more of a Visual Studio person? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we now have an exciting new announcement of Visual Studio support for GitHub Codespaces. I'm going to show you a demo of it. You can sign up at that same link that I had on the previous slide, and that'll put you in a wait list to get into this Visual Studio support. But for now, let's dive into a demo of Visual Studio support for GitHub Codespaces. All right, so I've opened up Visual Studio 2019, and you'll notice that there's a new tab in the top here called Connect to a Codespace. And if I go ahead and click on that, It's going to load up my GitHub account here, which I've specified, and it's going to list out any code spaces that I currently have. I don't have any right now, so it's prompting me to create a new one. And all you have to do is just paste in the link to a GitHub repository. In this case, I'm going to use the game 2048. This is a fork that I have of that project. And you can also choose your instance type here. So in this case, I'm using an 8-core, 16GB RAM machine to power my code space. But you could select whatever power you feel is necessary for that online development environment hosted in the cloud. Lastly, you can specify a suspension time. So if I want my code base to suspend after 2 hours, I can do that. But choose whatever time best fits your needs, and that plays more into a pay for what you use kind of a model, pay for what you need. So with that, let's go ahead and just create our code space. All right, so this has opened up Visual Studio 2019, and you can see that the code space is being initialized right now. So what that means is that the repository is getting cloned, and that online development environment is being configured for me based on some specifications in the repository. Right now I'm connecting to the code space, but while that's happening, I want to explain a little bit about what we're seeing. So this is the familiar Visual Studio 2019 UI. And my laptop here is responsible for powering that UI, but everything else, all the other compute-heavy tasks are offloaded from my machine to my code space. So whatever cloud cores I have are going to be responsible for doing the bulk of the heavy lifting here, which is really nice because that frees up my local machine. And so you can see now the Solution Explorer is populated, and this is a CMake project. You can see that there's a CMake list txt right there. And so if we swing over to the CMake output, we can see that CMake generation automatically ran and has finished successfully. So before I do anything else, let's just go ahead and build. Again, I haven't done anything yet. I haven't configured anything at all. This was all done for me by Codespaces, and the build has succeeded. So I've already built targeting windows, didn't have to do anything except for paste a GitHub repository into Codespaces. And I was already ready to go. I've already built, and I can start contributing. But this is a cross-platform code base. So what about Linux? How can Codespaces help me there? Well, we recently added this awesome new feature here. So if I go to the output and click the Codespaces WSL provisioning log, we can actually see it successfully provisioned WSL, and it's got this version of Ubuntu 20.04. Whoops. 2004. And so in this configuration dropdown, I also have a WSL Linux debug configuration ready to go, ready to be targeted. And if I look at the CMake output now, you can see CMake generation is now starting for targeting this configuration. I didn't do anything. My WSL Linux environment is configured, ready for me to build on it once this finishes. So here we go. The CMake generation has finished, and we should be good to go to build. So once again, I've just clicked build a couple times, didn't have to do anything else, and this should hopefully work if all goes smoothly. So here it goes, building, very fast, built. So in just a matter of a couple minutes, I went from pasting in a GitHub repository to building that code base targeting Windows and building it targeting Linux. That's pretty awesome. And so how did I get this environment configured? Well, if I go into this dev-init JSON file, this is where I specify some of the configurations that I want. So you can see I told it to use a WSL install tool, and I said, hey, anyone who creates a code space based on this repository, they should get these things automatically installed on WSL. So for example, rsync is getting installed, and so when we looked at the CMake output, we could see rsync was being used to copy files. So me as the new user onboarding to this code base, I didn't have to worry about any of that. It all just happened because of the way Codespaces works and this particular dev-init JSON file. So that's super nice. And I could obviously go jump into one of these files by just clicking it in the Solution Explorer. But, well, first of all, let me switch back to Windows. But I want to show you that your normal navigation features still exist in Codespaces as you would expect. So I like to show Control T in pretty much every demo that I do because I found that a lot of people don't know about it. And when they do, it's like a huge revelation. So I love showing it up in the top here. So again, you get to this by doing Control T or Control comma. And up in the top, there's various different buttons that you can click to filter your search. But an even faster way is if I just prepend my search with one of these letters. So if I'm looking for just files, I can just type in F. So in this case, I'm looking for a file that has the word input in it. And so we can see the results, and I'll just jump into the game input CPP file, just like that. And that those search results only showed me files. So it's super handy. Okay. In this file, we can see that we now have semantic colorization. When I had previously shown Codespaces with Visual Studio, we didn't have that yet, but now we do, so that's awesome. And if I use Control G, I can actually go jump down to a line 52, and oops, I accidentally scrolled up, sorry. We'll go to line 52, and we can just put a breakpoint here. And I'm putting a breakpoint in this part of the code because this is where the decision process happens in 2048 when I'm typing W, A, S, or D, which are essentially like the arrow keys up, down, left, right. And based on what I type, it should put me into one of these different cases. So we should hopefully hit this breakpoint. Let's go ahead and pick our target and debug this. Obviously the build succeeded because I just built it, so it'll just throw us right into this debug session. And boom, here's our console. It's a console implementation of 2048. And what I want to point out here, though, is see this cursor that's sort of following mine? That's because this console is actually being appcast from my code space to my local machine so that I'm able to actually interact with it here. So, for example, we can click 1 to start the game and then choose a board size. And now we're in the game 2048. And again, this is all just being cast to my local machine. The debugging, compute, and everything is happening in my code space, freeing up my local cores. So let's type a D, lowercase d right here, click enter. That should move all the numbers to the right, but obviously first we're going to hit this breakpoint where this decision process is happening. If I look in my locals window, which is available here in Codespaces, just as you would expect, we can see that the value of C, which is my input, is this D. But I do also want to show that I can hover over C and I can actually pin this data tooltip. It's a pretty nice feature, and if you want to move it, you can move it. So get it out of the way of your code, and it'll stay there. And so I've actually pinned this value, and I said I should move to the right because that's a D. And so let's go ahead and continue and see what happens. Let me open our app back up. Invalid input. Please try again. Okay, so we're having some sort of issue here. And what's actually pretty nifty about these tooltips is if I want, I can type a comment in here too. I could say like, invalid input. And, you know, I'm thinking maybe it's because it needs to be uppercase. So I'll go ahead and put that in my comment as well. But let's stop the debugging session and see if we can actually fix this problem. D should not be an invalid input. So I said it should move right, so let's take a look at this. We can peek the definition. And looks like, oh, the value, the value of that is capital D. And what did I type? So, super nifty feature. I forgot what value I had in my debugging session, but I pinned it. And if you look in the margin here, if I hover over that pin, it actually shows me the value from my debugging session, and it even shows that comment that I had written there. So I can see, oh, I had typed a lowercase d. Let's address that. So instead of just switching on the user's input, let's make it so they are allowed to type uppercase or lowercase, and let's just to upper that. Save it, and we should be good to go now. So now when I run this game, I should be able to use lowercase WASD keys without it causing any sort of an issue. So once again, this is being cast, and I'll just quickly get us back into the game board state. And now if I type like a lowercase d, it'll hit the breakpoint because I forgot to get rid of that. Let's continue. So moved everything to the right, and I can just keep using the WASD keys, and everything's working as expected, and we're playing the game 2048 in Codespaces, and it's all working very nicely. Sweet. So let's exit that debug session for now. And now that we've addressed that error, let's suppose I want to keep coding. You can see I'm in my Windows configuration right now. And maybe I want to jump into like game CPP. In this file, we see that there is a lot of different pound includes up at the top here. And I'm in my Windows configuration. Maybe I'm in a Windows mindset right now. Even though this is a cross-platform repository, I'm perhaps not thinking about it. So I do something like windows.h, oops, there we go, windows.h. And what you'll notice is I now have a purple squiggle under this pound include. And it's saying, hey, you're writing a cross-platform application, like pay attention. WSL doesn't know about windows.h. This Linux debug configuration doesn't know about that. And so this would be a build error for that. And to get this, I didn't even have to build. All I had was this WSL configuration here that Visual Studio knows about. And so it's reminding me to remember that I'm doing this cross-platform work. And so in real time, as I'm editing my code like this, I can be conscious of that and make sure that I'm doing the right things. And in Codespaces, I didn't even have to do any of that provisioning myself, right? Like WSL got automatically provisioned for me. So I'm getting this platform-specific IntelliSense essentially for free. I didn't have to do any extra manual steps. I've shown this before on local Visual Studio, and I had to set up the connection to WSL or to a remote Linux environment on my own. But Codespaces handles all of that for you. It already creates that connection, that WSL configuration for you. And so if I were to switch to that, then as you would expect, that squiggle turns to red because now with my active configuration, which is the Linux debug, this would actually be an error. So it turns red. Awesome. So that's how Codespaces can get you ramped up to cross-platform development super quickly, and people joining your code base can really quickly start contributing. But this is a relatively small code base, so I want to continue to show even more benefits of Codespaces. And to do that, let's switch on over to one of my other Codespaces, and that's of the OpenCV repository, which is a very large C++ project. And the awesome thing about Codespaces is that I can actually have multiple connections to Codespaces open at the same time because my local cores are all freed up because everything's running in the cloud. And so my local machine doesn't get bogged down by having multiple instances open. So here's OpenCV, and this is a very large C++ project. You can see there's a bunch of different C++ files here. And what I want to show is build acceleration, but this first build that I'm doing is not accelerated, but I am targeting Linux. And in a previous talk, I showed build acceleration targeting Windows. So at CPPCon, I want to show targeting Linux. And you can see the build is running. This is not accelerated, but this build above is getting accelerated. Now, this build is being accelerated because our development environment is in the cloud. So we're just taking advantage of these extra cloud cores to distribute that build and also take advantage of build output caching in order to get build acceleration here. Now, this is not going to be a part of the preview. I did just want to show it here to show you a direction that we could go, a direction that could make sense because of the fact that the development environment's in the cloud. But again, it won't be available in the preview. But with that being said, let's go ahead and swing back on over into the slides and do a recap of everything that we just saw. All right, so we saw how we can connect to a GitHub Codespace with Visual Studio and how the Codespace automatically can provision WSL2 for you, which makes onboarding to cross-platform repositories super simple. There's no manual configuration needed for Windows or Linux. All of that was done for me. I was able to build targeting both of those right out the gate. And we also saw platform-specific IntelliSense, which exists outside of Codespaces as well. But in Codespaces, since all the WSL provisioning is done for you, you also just get platform-specific IntelliSense as a benefit of that. And lastly, we had a forward-looking section where I showed build acceleration targeting Linux. And again, here's the link that you can go to if you want to get on the wait list to this Visual Studio support. And with that, that wraps up my talk. I just want to once again remind you all about these links in case you didn't see them before or you didn't have a chance to screen grab it. Take a screenshot now, and there's a couple other slides that I want to rush through real quick. Here are the talks that we already had. Hopefully you got a chance to see some of those earlier in the week. If not, recommend checking these out for sure. And then today we had a few more talks, and on Friday, our team is also giving a talk, which you should definitely check out. All right. Thank you all so much. I think now we can transition to a little Q&A. I think we have a couple minutes. If not, definitely go to our expo hall and I will be there to answer any follow-up questions. Thank you all so much.